Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Scary Tales. If this is your first time joining us here, then welcome to the darker side of history. If you've got a taste for real-life accounts of the weird, the twisted, and the downright terrifying, you're in the perfect place, because here, we dig up the bones of forgotten stories and examine every haunted detail. And trust me, today's tale is one you don't want to miss. But before we jump in, don't forget to sneak up behind that like button, throw a hood over its head, drag it into the woods, and bury it. All the while placing a curse so horrible on it that when it's uncovered in 1,000 years, it'll wreak havoc on those that discovered it. And now, on to tonight's story. A tale so obscure, so eerie, that you'll be spending your time on Google afterward just to see how true it is. In the early months of 1972, something truly bizarre and unsettling happened in the quiet town of Hexum, England. Now, this small and unassuming town was nestled in a very picturesque countryside of Northumberland, became the epicenter of a mystery that's puzzled and terrified those who've dared to explore it. It's a place where two small, seemingly innocuous stone objects have been at the heart of an inexplicable and eerie set of occurrences that has happened for decades. It all started in the garden of an ordinary suburban home on a chilly February day. The Robson family, the parents and their two sons, Colin, aged 11, and Leslie, aged 8, lived a fairly typical life. The boys were like most young children, full of energy, full of curiosity, and on that one fateful day, the brothers were outside playing, and they were just digging in the dirt, as kids often do, when they happened to unearth something strange, to say the least. Now, as Colin's small shovel hit something solid, he called his brother over, and together they cleared the soil to reveal two small stone heads, each about the size of a tennis ball. Now, the heads were crudely carved, yet they had distinct features: sharp nose, hollow eyes, very thin lips, and one head appeared to be more masculine, with a stern expression, while the other seemed more delicate, and possibly even feminine. Now, at first, the boys were excited, thinking they'd found some kind of treasure. But as they held these cold, smooth stones in their hands, a sense of unease began to slowly creep in, and they didn't know why. The heads were strange, almost otherworldly, and they felt unnaturally heavy for their size. But, kids being kids, Colin and Leslie didn't think too much of it. They rushed inside, they showed their mother, and at first she'd kind of dismissed the heads as nothing more than just odd rocks. They placed them on the mantelpiece, and the family thought a little more of the find. But the heads were far from ordinary, and the Robsons were about to find that out in the most unsettling of ways. They didn't have the heads for too long. You know, they were brought into the house, and then strange things began to happen. And at first, it was just small, kind of easily explainable incidents, like things going missing, only to turn up in an unexpected place. Like a hairbrush left on the bathroom counter. It would appear on the table. Or a pair of shoes that were placed by the front door would be found upstairs. Now, the family kind of chalked it up to forgetfulness, or maybe even the boys just playing tricks on each other. But soon, these occurrences became much harder to explain. One evening, Mrs. Robson was alone in the house, sitting in the living room, just reading a book. The house was quiet, just the faint ticking of the clock, just breaking the silence, just tick, tick. And suddenly, she heard a loud crash coming from what seemed to be the kitchen. Now, startled, she jumped up, she rushed to see what had just happened, and she found that a heavy glass jar, which had been previously sitting securely on the counter, had somehow fallen to the floor and shattered. But what truly terrified her was the sight of the marbles that had been inside the jar. These marbles were spinning in place, as if controlled by some unseen force. Miss Robson watched in horror as the marbles whirled faster and faster and faster before abruptly stopping and then scattering in all directions. Now, shaken, Miss Robson tried to kind of rationalize what she'd seen. Maybe the jar had just been precariously balanced and the marbles just rolled due to the uneven floor. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The house just didn't feel the same anymore. There was a heaviness in the air, kind of just this sense of unease that seemed to grow with each passing day. And it wasn't just Mrs. Robinson who felt it. The whole family began to notice it. And sometimes the temperature in the house would just suddenly drop for no reason. And the rooms would grow unnervingly cold, even with the heater on full blast. There were times when the family members felt that they were being watched, their skin just kind of prickling with unease, with some unseen presence. And they'd never felt any of this before. They'd never felt any of this before the Stones came into their home. And then came the nightmares. Miss Robson, who had always slept soundly, began waking up just abruptly in the middle of the night, just drenched in sweat. Her heart just pounding with terror. She would lie in bed, paralyzed with fear, convinced that something or someone was in the room with her, just watching her from the shadows. And the boys, too, began having vivid nightmares, dreams of these strange, faceless figures in dark, foreboding places. The family's sleep was disturbed almost every night, and they began to dread the coming of this unforeseen darkness. Now, the Robsons tried to ignore these strange occurrences, and they were kind of just hoping that they would stop on their own. But instead, the activities only kind of intensified. Objects would move on their own. Doors would slam shut without warning. And this eerie cold became more frequent. It was as if the heads had brought something into the house. Something dark. Something malevolent. Now, desperate for answers, the Robsons decided to seek help. They didn't know a whole lot about the history of the area or the significance of the heads, but they were convinced that the objects were the source of their troubles. So, they reached out to local historians and archaeologists, hoping that maybe someone could shed some kind of light on the origins, at least, of the stone heads. They were convinced that this was at the heart of their troubles. Now, their inquiries eventually led them to one Dr. Anne Ross. Now, she was a well-respected Celtic historian and archaeologist, and she'd spent much of her career studying ancient artifacts, particularly those from pre-Roman Britain. And when she heard about the Robson family's discovery, she was intrigued. The description of the heads reminded her of ancient Celtic stone carvings, often associated with rituals and ceremonies. So, she agreed to come and visit the Robsons' home and to kind of come and examine the heads in person and give them her own take on what this could possibly be. And when she arrived, she was immediately struck by the atmosphere in the house. There was just this strange, palpable tension in the air, a sense of foreboding that seemed to emanate from the very walls. And as she was shown the stone heads, Dr. Ross felt a shiver just run down the back of her spine. And the heads were indeed reminiscent of ancient Celtic carvings, but there was something very off about them. They seemed almost alive, as if they were watching her with those hollow, unblinking eyes. And despite her unease, Dr. Ross was eager to study the heads. She believed that they could be of some significant historical value, possibly. So, it could date back thousands of years. And With the Robsons' permission, she wanted to take him back to her home in Wales, where she planned to conduct a thorough examination. Now, of course, the family was relieved to be rid of the objects, kind of hoping that their removal would bring an end to the disturbances. But, sadly, even after the heads were gone, strange activity in the house continued. And then, things started getting strange for Dr. Ross as well. Now, back in Wales, Dr. Ross set up the heads in her study. She planned to begin her research the following day, but that night, she was awoken by this strange sensation. The room had grown intensely cold, far colder than it should have been. Now, given the mild weather outside, she thought, well, this is odd. But she pulled the blankets up to her chin, but the chill seemed to seep into her bones, all over her entire body. And as she lay there, trying to shake off the cold, she began to hear the soft, whispering voice. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, filling the room with this unintelligible murmur, and more voices grew. Now her heart began to race. She lived alone, and the thought of someone or something in her home just terrified her to her core. So she just lay there listening, just trying to make sense of these voices, but they were speaking in a language that she couldn't understand, a language she'd never heard before. And the whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they reached this crescendo. And then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. And the silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Dr. Ross's ragged breathing. She was terrified. And the next morning, Dr. Ross tried to rationalize in her head what had happened. Of course, she was a scientist, so she told herself it had been a dream. My mind's playing tricks on me, But the experience had left her shaken. And as she looked at the stone head sitting innocently on her desk, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of dread, and she didn't know why. So she decided to continue with her research. She hoped that she would uncover the history of the heads, and that in doing so, that might provide some answers. So over the next few weeks, Dr. Ross just delved into her studies, But unfortunately, these strange occurrences continued. She'd be studying, and then she would hear these footsteps in the hallway outside. They'd be heavy and deliberate, as if someone was just pacing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The voices returned, sometimes in the dead of night, sometimes in the middle of the day. Objects in her home would move on their own. And she began to see these fleeting shadows out of the corner of her eye. And, she thought, am I going crazy? What is happening? She'd never experienced anything like this ever before. And one night, she had this horrifying encounter. She was woken once again by the cold, but this time, there was something different. When she opened her eyes, she found herself staring at a figure that was just standing at the foot of her bed, watching over her. It was tall, dark, it didn't have any discernible features, it was just a shadow. But its presence was overwhelming, and she felt paralyzed with fear. Like she couldn't move, she couldn't do anything. It was like sleep paralysis, but it wasn't, it was real. But this figure just stood there for what felt like an eternity, just watching her, before it slowly faded away, just leaving her trembling by herself in the darkness in fear and dread and despair. And she knew she couldn't continue living like this. The stone heads had brought something into her home. She knew this, something malevolent, and she needed to get rid of them. But before she could, she felt compelled to understand what they were and where they came from. Now, Dr. Ross, again being this determined scientist, just told herself, I'm going to get to the bottom of this mystery. No matter what happens to me, I'm going to do it. So she reached out to her colleague, Dr. Don Robbins, who's an expert in earth mysteries and ancient energies. And Dr. Robbins was intrigued by the story, to say the least, and he agreed to examine the heads. When he arrived at Dr. Ross's home, He too felt the oppressive atmosphere that had just seemed to kind of accompany these heads. He didn't believe it at first, but once he was there, he knew, and he studied them closely. And he couldn't help but say that the resemblance was that of Celtic stone carvings. But he sensed there was something more to them. He didn't know what. They looked familiar, but he didn't know what they were specifically. So he thought the heads were connected to the landscape of Hexum itself, maybe, possibly linked to what they call ley lines, which are ancient pathways of energy that crisscross the earth. Now, it's theorized that the heads had been placed in the ground in a specific location to harness the energy of these ley lines. And when the Robson boys dug them up, they disturbed something. They disturbed a balance, releasing a force that had been contained for centuries. Now, as Dr. Robbins shared this theory with Dr. Ross, she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. This idea that these heads were connected to some ancient, powerful energy was terrifying, but it was also hard to believe. But it also made sense. The disturbances in her home, the shadowy figure, the voices, they all seemed to be tied to these heads. And Dr. Ross knew that she had to return them back to Hexum, to put them back where they belonged, and just hope, hey, you know what? Once they're back, this will all stop. We can go back about it. Now, the journey back to Hexum was tense. She could feel the weight of these heads in the trunk of her car. It felt like a million bricks. And with each mile, the sense of foreboding grew stronger. And when she finally arrived at the Robsons' home, she was relieved to see that the family was doing better. The strange occurrences had lessened, but they hadn't completely stopped. But this gave her hope. She thought, okay, maybe it's just a matter of time. But she explained her findings to the family, and with their permission, she went out back and she buried the heads in the same spot where the boys had found them. Now, as she covered them with dirt, she felt this sense of peace, as if the earth was settling. And she hoped this would be the end of the disturbances. She really did. She hoped that the heads would return to their dormant state, and that this dark energy that they had released would be contained once more. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Even after the heads were buried, the mystery didn't end. Dr. Ross continued to be haunted by these memories of her experiences, and the Robsons reported occasional strange occurrences themselves. The stone heads had left a lasting mark on all who had come into contact with them, and their story continues to captivate and terrify those who hear it. To this very day, these heads, the Hexum heads, remain an enigma. Were these ancient relics imbued with some powerful energy? Were they simply stones, their power just kind of magnified by the fear and imagination of those who found them? Honestly, the truth may never be known. But one thing is certain: the Hexum heads are far more than they seem, and their mystery is one that will endure for generations to come. Currently, the Hexum heads are on display in a museum, and no reports of any strange occurrences have happened in the last few years. Let's hope this is the end of the Hexum curse. So, if you like today's tale, what I need you to do is do not forget to grab that like button, drag it away somewhere, and hide it from humanity. That way the curse of the like button can never be imbued upon humanity again. Trust me, it's better this way. Also, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. That way you never miss an episode. We upload once or twice a week. I am trying to get better with consistency of uploads, although my job does unfortunately make it hard to commit to a schedule, but I am trying, I promise. And if you guys stick with me, the channel will continue to improve. Everyone's suggestions, support, comments, all that stuff helps way more than you guys can imagine. So if you want to hear more and you want to support this channel, all you got to do is give a like, and a subscribe. If you want to drop a comment, it's much appreciated. So until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that are all too real.